Copyright and Creative Commons. As with nearly every other aspect of modern life, our work with digital media has a legal aspect to it. Intellectual property issues are widespread in the digital world, and in many cases, the established laws have some difficulty keeping up with the technological and associated sociological changes. Laws that made sense when ideas were sold as scarce physical objects, like records and books and things like that, don't necessarily work very well sometimes for digital content. Copyright has traditionally been the type of law that was used to address these issues, but even that is evolving rapidly in the new environment. Now, we start, as we're going to for so many other topics in this class, with a little bit of history. For much of human history, the majority of people were illiterate. So for them to pass information from one individual to another required speaking and listening. While this characteristic is arguably one of the reasons for our species' survival, this was also a slow and imperfect way to pass information from person to person. Oral traditions and in-person performance were the only way that ideas, stories, and songs were produced and transmitted and consumed by most people. For those that were illiterate, passing on information was a difficult and sometimes very expensive process. Before the 15th century and the invention of the printing press, all books were created with pen and ink, and that made copying take a long time, sometimes months or years. So during these pre-copyright days, what we now call piracy was actually very, very common and was not necessarily seen as a bad thing. In a world lit by candles and warmed by open fires, what libraries existed were constantly in danger of being burned down. So making copies of books was necessary to ensure the survival of these stories through the passage of time. And as societies began to mix due to improved transportation and trade, these ideas spread more rapidly than ever before. The Romans were famous for copying the architecture and art, and fashion, literature, even much of the religion of the Greeks. They combined this with ideas from other areas of their expanding empire and laid the foundations of the modern Western world. And they did this largely through what we would now call pirating the works of those they traded with or that they conquered. This trend continued even after the fall of the Roman Empire. When Europeans first started interacting with China, they appropriated a great deal of technology, including gunpowder and perhaps even noodles. So why is licensing important? If that old system worked so well for the ancients, why do we focus so much on intellectual property in the 21st century? Well, licensing is important for a number of reasons. First, it provides rules for use. And second, it provides an original work, it protects an original work from being claimed by someone other than the original artist. And finally, it provides a financial incentive for people to be creative. You're more apt to focus your life on your talents and creations if you can actually make a living from it. So let's take a look at these individually. So the first one, it provides rules for use. Without rules, work can easily be subverted. You may come up with a beautiful new idea, but without some sort of framework to connect that idea to you and your intentions for it, somebody else could come along and take credit for it and potentially profit from your work. Without protections for creative people, the most powerful entity in a market can define how things work. This is almost certainly not going to be the creator of the work, so these rules are intended to prevent an individual with a good idea or creation from being bullied by the stronger entities in the market. While we may like the romantic notion of a wild west of ideas where everything's competing, in reality, this isn't a very pleasant environment to work in. Original works need to be protected. Often an artist or a writer will have a specific idea in mind for their work. Misuse of this work can damage what the intended view of that work was. A really good example of this is what happened with the so-called Peeing Calvin idea from the last couple decades. Bill Watterson was the creator of the Calvin and Hobbes comic, and he never licensed any of the characters for use beyond the comics. Therefore, any t-shirts or toys or anything else that you ever see with any of the characters from Calvin and Hobbes are unauthorized uses of his work. Now, starting in the mid 90s, it became disturbingly common to see stickers, especially in car windows and trucks and things like that, of a likeness of Calvin standing there peeing on something that obviously the person that's driving that vehicle doesn't like. It could be the Ford logo or Microsoft or a sports team or whatever. Um, and how this actually turned out is a really interesting story. So please make sure to read the tasteless history of the Peeing Calvin decal article that's linked in the class. It's an excellent example of how things can go a little bit different than you might expect with these issues. And our last reason for needing these rules is to provide a financial incentive for creative work. This is the heart of so many things. Money. Artists and writers and programmers all need money to live, just like the rest of us. We have this romantic notion of the starving artist whose needs for expression, far outweigh their need for food, shelter, and companionship. And if any artist actually feels this way, they're probably not going to feel that way for long because, as their label states, they're going to starve to death. So we do owe it to the people that create the things that we love to make sure that they can feed themselves, at the very least. However, for most of the last 100 years, the money very rarely flows directly from the consumer to the artist. And so what's now called big media complicates this when much of the profits for a work never actually make their way to the creator. So this has become more and more of an issue as the companies that distribute media have consolidated, and that really reduces the choice in the marketplace of ideas. And I have, again, another link in the class that goes into greater depth on that. So let's talk about copyright itself. So the way that these issues have been dealt with in the past several hundred years has been through copyright law. The idea is to give exclusive rights to a work to the creator for a specific amount of time. That way they're clearly defined as the originator, and they can direct the use of their work and grant a literal right to copy, which is where the word comes from, as well as how their work can be adapted and performed and so on. This is a great idea, but copyright law has seen a bit of change over the years. This chart shows an expansion in the duration of copyright terms since the founding of the United States. Originally, copyright was less than 30 years, and this is reasonable. That's roughly, within the adult lifespan of a human. But we've seen a series of acts that have led to an expansion of these copyright terms, first to 40 years and then 60 years and so forth, until the 1998 Sonny Bono Act that extended these terms well over 100 years, far greater than the entire average lifespan of a human being. So clearly copyright now is more about corporate profits than protecting individual artists. Many call this latest act, the Mickey Mouse Protection Act, and say that this is corporate welfare. The Mickey Mouse Protection Act idea came about because, that law effectively prevented Disney's most iconic character from ever going into the public domain. So, public domain. You see, the original idea with copyright was that it would balance between the good that can come from a creative person having control over their work for a limited amount of time, and the societal benefit, on the other hand, that comes from the free access to ideas. When the founders of our country implemented the system for copyright law, a vital part of this was what happened at the end. Works that had, would become part of the public domain after that limited copyright period. So then they could be part of the cultural and technological heritage of our society. So examples of this would be things like Shakespeare's plays and poetry, the works of Beethoven, the King James Bible, and many of the early silent films. These are all in the public domain. Anybody has access to them. However, due to these changes to the copyright law, many of the works of the 20th century and beyond will never become part of the public domain. They will forever be locked up as the property of corporate entities that live far longer than any human. And that's a little bit different than what the original intent of copyright law was.